Hello, my name is Dr. Carl Binder. I'm president of the Fluency Project, which is a not-for-profit devoted to making available information about precision teaching and fluency-based instruction. And also, I'm CEO of the Performance Thinking Network, which is a performance consulting company. I was a student with B.F. Skinner. I was one of his last graduate students at Harvard. And I was also mentored by some very important people, some very well-known people in the fields of behavior science and performance improvement, including Ogden Lindsley and Beatrice Barrett and Tom Gilbert and Jill Harless and Gary Rumler and several others that I was fortunate to meet and learn from. But Dr. Eric Haughton, or Eric Christian Haughton, as he occasionally said because he liked his middle name, was probably the most impactful on my career other than Dr. Skinner, who really started it for me. And he's not very well known, by and large, outside of the field of precision teaching, and even within precision teaching, of which he was, as it says on the slide, a co-founder. He's not widely known because he died in 1985, and several generations of precision teachers have evolved now, only perhaps knowing a few of his articles. So I feel committed to making his work more broadly available, not only to precision teachers and people interested in fluency-based instruction, but actually to some of our colleagues in behavior science and perhaps even in the field of developmental psychology, as you will see later in the presentation. In my opinion, Eric Haughton was a genius in his application and understanding of Skinner's measure, rate of response or behavior frequency. And that is what Skinner himself considered to be his most important contribution. He created a natural science of behavior when he discovered rate of response as the most sensitive measure we have of the likelihood or strength of response. Now, this presentation was originally delivered at the 2025 conference of the Standard Acceleration Society, which is a community of people devoted to precision teaching and related applications of standard measurement. But another reason that I wanted to record this is because we want to get it to a much broader audience than that. It's also very difficult to talk about the work of Eric Haughton without mentioning his late wife. Both of them have now passed, but Elizabeth Haughton died only about a year ago. And they were partners in life as well as in work for many years. And Elizabeth not only was my, in many respects, best friend for about 50 years, was also an enormous contributor and one who applied many of the insights and actually sort of shared those, especially in the 60s and 70s and early 80s when they were working together and married. Now, here's a few pictures of Eric, just to give you a flavor for the man. On the far left, you will see Eric Haughton when he was a new professor, just out of graduate school as a doctoral student with Ogden Lindsley at the University of Oregon. And you'll learn later about some of his students that have made enormous contributions themselves. But here's a few other pictures. In the middle, you see him early in his career. In those two pictures in the middle, both of which have Elizabeth Haughton in them. And the top, the woman with the longer dark hair and the light-colored pinkish sweater, and the bottom toward the right. And then on the far right, you'll see a picture of him a little bit later, a few years later, with Harold Kunzelman, who was also a very important contributor in the field of precision teaching, and particularly what has come to be called learning screening, curriculum-based measurement, progress monitoring. These are just a couple other pictures of Eric in the far upper left with Ogden Lindsley, who was his PhD advisor. And then below that, a picture with children. And I always liked seeing pictures of Eric with children because he was not really an academic in the traditional sense, even though he taught at several universities and colleges. He was in the trenches, as you might say, with children in schools, in classrooms. He was always working with kids, and he loved kids, and he was very much devoted to children's education. On the bottom left, his picture on vacation, sailing a small boat. He was a sailor, and he had a lot of fun in the outdoors. He was a proud Canadian also, as I'll mention a little bit later. And then on the right, you see pictures toward the end of his life. He died very prematurely at the age of 51 from cancer. And toward the end, he got very thin and his beard turned whitish, but he was smiling. And then on the bottom, even when he was in the hospital toward the end of his life, you can see an Apple computer above his head there, and you can see he was still engaged with things. And in the middle, one of the more famous pictures of Eric with his Greek sailor's hat on. Now, Eric expressed a great deal of gratitude for his teacher, Ogden Lindsley. And this is a pretty strong statement he made in the front of his doctoral dissertation, which was done in 1967. He said, Dr. Ogden Lindsley holds a special place, for as a committee member and warm personal friend, I find few words that express my gratitude. I'm proud to be his protege. I've learned more from Og than from any other man or from any other relationship. His effort to stimulate and maintain high quality strategic and tactical efforts will never decelerate. And finally, I owe gratitude to Og for seducing me into the profession of precision educators, a profession in which I finally feel at home. Now, when Eric passed away, Dr. Lindsley actually wrote his obituary for the American Psychological Association, and in it he says this: at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday, 11 July 1985, Eric Christian Haughton lost his 19-month bout with liver cancer, and the world lost a great man. Applied behavior analysis lost one of its first and most dedicated contributors. Precision teaching lost one of its founders and a major force in developing the concept and procedures of behavioral fluency. Those are pretty strong statements from a man who himself was a extraordinary scientist and contributor. Now, I like to show this because Eric loved beauty. He was very creative. His environment was always filled with beautiful things, with old clocks. But toward the end of his life, he created jewelry. And on the left is some of the jewelry he created. And then on the right is actually a ring that is on my finger. And he designed and produced a number of these rings that have what standard acceleration charters and precision teachers will recommend as a times two acceleration, a doubling of performance per week. He was also very creative in the way he thought about things. And I show this just to give you an idea about how broad-ranging Eric's thinking was. I spent a fair amount of time living with him and his wife up in their cottage in Hastings County, Ontario, during the late 70s when I was doing my dissertation in Elizabeth's first grade classroom and being advised by Eric. And I remember one night when we were standing outside underneath the bright sky of stars, and he raised the question of, and precision teachers will appreciate this, how many cycles on the standard acceleration chart would we need to be able to, on the same chart, have the frequency of the universe that is once in 13.77 billion years, and the frequency of light, which is 4,996 and some change kilometers per minute. And that was the kind of thinking that Eric engaged in. ChatGPT says there would be 18 cycles needed. I'm not sure of the math, but the normal chart that we use is only 6 cycles. But Eric had a very big perspective on things. And as he often said, I think I'll quote him a little bit later, he said, everything has a frequency, including behavior, of course. He was also always up for a good time. This is just a picture of him having a good time. And one of the things that Eric loved, he loved food and music and beauty. And it was almost famous for saying, if you ask him, which would you like, Eric, the chocolate or the vanilla? He would say both. I choose both. He loved life to the fullest. So I give you these initial sort of slides and ideas just to give you a sense of the man. He was creative and brilliant. Now, if you look over his life's work, his curriculum vitae, as you might call it, He actually started out before precision teaching, making a really big contribution before he even had his master's degree in what was then called behavior modification in the early 1960s. He worked with two giants in the field, Ted Allione and Jack Michael, who was also his advisor. And they were working together in projects in Saskatchewan, Canada. Um, and this is one of the articles that was published. And I want to tell you a little bit about it because it reflects, again, a little bit about Eric. Um, this was a psychiatric ward. And back in the 60s, of course, psychiatric wards were pretty sad places where many of the residents were just standing around all day or doing nothing. And it was often the case that they would be doing things that seemed to be purposeless. And so there was a woman there who tended to stand around in the ward, and the behaviorists, Ted and Jack and Eric, decided to pay attention to her when she was holding a broom. And so they did this. They reinforced that behavior, basically. And so she wound up spending a good deal of time in the ward holding a broom, standing up, standing broom on the end, standing up in the middle of the ward. And after that was a well-established behavior, they inquired with some of the psychologists who were working there, who were traditional sort of Freudian psychodynamic psychologists, who absolutely diagnosed her as having a phallic complex, an Oedipal complex, and having an issue with a phallic thing, that is the broom. Uh, the guys then basically quit paying attention to the lady and they extinguished that behavior and it went away. So this was kind of a big joke, but it was also a nice demonstration of the power of reinforcement and how we need not use theoretical frameworks like Freudian psychology. But that was before and while he was a master's student. He finished his master's degree in clinical and experimental psychology at the University of Toronto after a BA in philosophy and psychology. And I highlight philosophy because, again, Eric was a big thinker. And it was not a surprise to me when I learned that he had been an undergraduate philosophy major, which, by the way, so was I. And that may be accounted for some of the affinity. We loved each other immediately. He then went from his master's degree to become a research assistant at B.F. Skinner and Jim Holland's work at the Office of Programmed Instruction at Harvard, when basically programmed instruction was being invented. But as would be typical for Eric, he did something quite unusual, which he worked with a very famous crystallographer and design man, Arthur Loeb, to create a series of programmed instruction modules that taught essentially geometry and things related to crystallography without any words whatsoever. And of course, most program instruction was used with words. This was, of course, before any of his famous contributions to precision teaching, but it was at Harvard when he was working with Skinner that he met Ogden Lindsley. And Lindsley had started the behavior research company at Harvard, or behavior research laboratory, rather, at Harvard Medical School with Dr. Skinner, who was his doctoral advisor. And so Eric and Ogden Lindsley met one another and they formed a friendship. And when Lindsley decided to move from basic research at Harvard to Kansas University Special Education, he basically sent Eric Haughton and Ann Duncan ahead of him to become doctoral students at Kansas and then joined them. And Eric wound up doing his PhD thesis with Og Lindsley, using an early version of the standard acceleration chart to assess the relative value of reinforcers with behavior frequency. During that time, of course, this is why he's often called a co-founder of precision teaching, and that's what Lindsley called him. Eric worked with Og Lindsley and Ann and a few of the other students at the time to basically create what we now call precision teaching and to design the original standard behavior charts. When he finished his PhD, as you saw in one of the earlier slides, Eric went to the University of Oregon. And there he had graduate students, some masters, some doctoral students that included people whose names we know now. Clay Starlin, who is still with us, Abigail Calkin, who also is, Owen White, who passed away some years ago, but was a major contributor to precision teaching, and other really important contributors in the field were his graduate students. He also there, while he was there, met his wife to be Elizabeth, who had been called Betty Freeman, but became Elizabeth Haughton. During that time, he got involved with Harold Kunzelman and a number of other folks in what was called the Seattle Spokane Tacoma Project. And this was a groundbreaking study and project in which 18,000 children from I believe kindergarten through eighth grade were given 7 to 10 days of 1-minute timings on a variety of basic academic skills. And that was when this standard behavior chart was used, and there were many computers in those days. This was the early 70s, to do what they call learning screening. And Kunzelman was a really important contributor to this. But what they were able to do is look at not only the frequencies, how quickly students could write math facts and read words and so forth, but also what their change was over a 7 to 10 day period. And they were able to project with very high degree of accuracy which students would later be referred for special education. And this was important because it was a foundational contribution to what later became curriculum-based measurement and learning screening. Many people in the field of progress monitoring do not realize that this whole thing of learning of progress monitoring came through the precision teaching world. And in fact, Clay Starlin was an important player in this, because when Clay finished his degree, he and Ann Starlin went to Minnesota, and there was a young professor from the University of Minnesota, Stan Dino, who got very excited at a workshop that Clay and Ann had done on behavior frequency, because he'd never learned about that before. And he went back, and they never heard from him again. But Dino turned out to be one of the major sort of founders of the field of progress monitoring. Also, as it says there were hundreds of practice sheets developed. And so Kunzelman and Haughton's et al. Developed the methodology for creating very efficient practice sheets for screening, for measurement, and for practice. Eric was then recruited to York University in Toronto. And part of that is because he was a proud Canadian. And this was the period, as you can see, from 72 to 74, which was the Vietnam War time. And so he kind of wanted to move out of the US. And he went back to Canada and was a professor at York University. And beside doing a variety of things and teaching people, he became editor of Special Education in Canada, which you will see a little bit later became sort of a way to get information out about precision teaching and what later became fluency-based instruction. During that period, he also was an advisor to Ray Beck and Dick Clement for the Sacagawea Precision Teaching Project in Great Falls, Montana. And many people will probably know about this if you know about the history of precision teaching. But that was a very, very, I would say still the best return on investment educational study that I know of. In the Sacagawea School, which was an elementary school in Great Falls, Montana, they did about 20 to 30 minutes a day of timed practice, 1-minute timings and charting, essentially early precision teaching with elementary school kids. And over a 3-year period, the kids in that school raised their achievement test scores by 20 to 40 percentile points in different subtests compared to all of the other elementary schools in the district. That was an enormously impactful study, which then led to over 10 years of dissemination of training teachers all over the country, funded by the federal government, the Joint Dissemination Review Panel, in precision teaching. Unfortunately, as we've learned over the years, measurably effective instruction doesn't last very long in public schools because new fads tend to replace it. But that was a very important bit of work, and it really helped establish precision teaching as a powerful methodology. And Eric was one of a number of advisors there. And then he moved after York University. He was recruited to Hastings County Board of Education, which was in Ontario. And the mission that he and Elizabeth Haughton and also a few others, including Michael Maloney, were asked to do was to transform that school district. And so they came in. That's about when I met them. And they started developing practice materials, curriculum with all of teams of teachers to build precision teaching and also Zig Engelman's direct instruction into how things were done in Hastings County Board of Education. And they were working sort of 1 year at a time. They would develop the measurement tools and the practice materials, sort of 1 year at a time. Unfortunately, as happens usually, is a new superintendent came along and decided he wanted to adopt some other fad, and Eric and Michael Maloney, who were advisors, they were not direct classroom teachers, were no longer had a job. Now Elizabeth was able to continue as a first grade, as an elementary school teacher, but that meant that Eric went and got a job at Loyalist College, a local college in early childhood education. And by the way, Michael Maloney went off and started the first storefront learning center, Quinte Learning Center, in Belleville, Ontario, which combined direct instruction and precision teaching, and from which Kent Johnson and others later learned how to combine those two things. And it really created the foundation for the Morningside model. And Michael has also been helpful in helping many others, including Richard McManus, Danielle Costa, and others, build learning centers that combine direct instruction and precision teaching. And while at Loyalist College, though, Eric also had a bunch of students. These were sort of associate degree type students. And Plainfield Children's Hospital, which was a place where pretty severely disabled people lived. I visited there at that time where Annie Desjardins, who was getting her associate's degree with Eric, first learned about precision teaching. That was also a time during which Elizabeth and Eric Haughton worked with Terry Harris, who is a somewhat famous case. Terry is now in his 50s, but Terry was born with severe cerebral palsy, and doctors and psychologists told his parents that they should just put him in an institution because he would never learn to walk or talk or whatever. Well, Eric and Elizabeth Haughton spent many, many hours with Terry and his family, and Terry was also in class in, I believe, Elizabeth's kindergarten or first grade class. And Terry now is a very capable man. He's, I believe, in his 50s. He has a master's degree. He's married. He drives. He's a motivational speaker. He's an amazingly capable man. He still has cerebral palsy, but they use precision teaching to build his repertoire from the ground up. So that was a very important contribution during a period when Eric was also working with physical therapists and others to identify, as you'll see later, the core bits of behavior, what he called elements that need to be practiced and built in order to support development of more complex skills. So in that time, he mentored Annie Desjardins. I was doing my doctoral study with him. He was my real advisor in my doctoral thesis that I finished in 1977 or 78. And then Jim Pollard and Richard McManus, who were students or proteges of mine, Eric and Elizabeth both influenced them greatly when they visited us in New England. And then Kent Johnson, somewhat later, when I and B. Barrett turned him on to precision teaching, he connected up with Eric. And so Eric was a big influence on Kent as well. Unfortunately, Eric left us in July of 1985. But what a remarkable set of accomplishments for someone who lived to only be 51 years old. Now, I want to kind of recap what I've just told you in another way, and I want to list his contributions, and then we're going to dive into more details. But he was, as I already mentioned, a contributor to early behavior modification case studies, a handful of which were reprinted in books. When I first got into this field, when I started working in a research lab for about 10 years, first in an operant conditioning laboratory, and then subsequently running a research precision teaching classroom for almost 10 years. These were the studies that were in books reprinted, and included a bunch of the ones, including the Broom Lady study by Eric and his advisors at that time. He did the program instruction work, but without words, which was enormously innovative. He helped create the standard chart with Lindsley and Duncan and others. His dissertation was an early application of a primitive version of the standard behavior chart, but using the chart to measure reinforcement behavior frequencies. He also participated, and also with his a few graduate students. Clay Starlin was involved in this, but applying what Lindsley had taught him about functional analysis of behavior. And one of the things that Ogden Lindsley communicated early on when he went from basic research into classroom work was he had to get rid of the jargon of behavior science and use plain English. And so functional analysis, which is a kind of a technical term in the behavior science world, got turned into is-does. And what that means is here's the environmental conditions, the things that come before behavior, the things that come after behavior, the behavior itself. This is the operational description of what you see. But then when you change things, like, for example, the things that happen after behavior or the things that come before behavior, and if you see a measurable effect on behavior, that's called the function of those things. And the way that was described is-does. And there was a whole period in which Eric and Ogden Lindsley and Clay Starlin and others were basically teaching teachers how to think that way. One of the things is really well before precision teaching really came to fruition, Eric was also beginning to use behavior frequencies to do what he called or to do assays of student performance, which was pre-curriculum-based measurement. It was kind of the early roots of that. He worked with Ann Starlin and others and Clay to bring precision teaching into regular schools, and they went on to do a lot of work themselves. And one of the big contributions that was made during that period in the, I guess, late 60s, early 70s, was the adoption of 1-minute timings. Because Ogden Lindsley, who brought behavior science out of the laboratory into the classroom, he brought an experimental analysis of behavior. His early publications and the work that he had done was about what he called direct and continuous measurement. And so you would see examples of early uses of the standard behavior chart for things like out of seat behavior and so forth. And they would time and measure all day for, the whole classroom period or whatever. And that's what he believed was very important. But Kunzelman in particular, and with Eric, persuaded Ogden Lindsley that that 1-minute timings would allow them to look at skills in a very precise way. And Lindsley pushed back on this. There was, as I understand, quite an argument. And Ogden used to say, before he left us, that he was proud of the fact that he was able to ultimately have enough humility to accept a sort of correction from his graduate students. But it's important to know also that prior to doing short timings of behavior frequency or rate of response, rate of response was more an indicator really of motivation, effective consequences, and so forth than anything else. But as soon as you go to short timings, and you see how quickly and smoothly and accurately a student can perform within that short period, all of a sudden you now have a profoundly sensitive measure of skill. There's also a thing I will show you a little bit later, but as Clay Starlin was really the first contributor in this way when he was a doctoral student with Eric Haughton. But as Eric proceeded to work on component behaviors, tried to identify the small bits of behavior that could be practiced before they're combined, he created this correlation chart in which you were able to take a bunch of learners or performers and look at their frequencies of two different skills, let's say saying sounds and saying words, or writing digits and doing math facts, and look for correlations. Because if there were correlations, there was a good indication that possibly if you built the frequency of the component, it would help in the acquisition and performance of the composite. So it was a tool that he developed and used quite a bit, but very few of our precision teaching colleagues have used since then. We do have a copy of the original version available at fluency.org, however. He created the learning channel matrix. Learning channels had existed for a while, and I wish that in fact, I'm sure I'll probably hear from Abigail Calkin and Clay Starlin, who are the other two people beside myself who've been around this long, because they can probably tell me more about this. But my recollection is that learning channels, which you'll learn about if you don't know about them already, that are very specific ways of talking about what form of input. Am I seeing something that I respond to? Am I hearing something? Am I touching it? Am I smelling it? Whatever. Am I freely behaving? And then what form of output? Is it write or say or type or whatever? And that was the way of very precisely describing the behavior being measured. Well, what Eric did is created a matrix, a tool that allowed people to look at and analyze curriculum, and I'll show you examples of that. He also, as you'll see, came up with this notion of a chemistry analogy, because what happened early on was that people started to discover that if you built the frequency of components, that would enable the frequency of combinations of those, called composites sometimes, or tool skills and basic skills. And what they began to look at was those relationships between smaller chunks of behavior and larger chunks that they formed. And they realized, of course, that it can hold down a whole complex hunk of behavior if the components are not what we later called fluent. And so Eric created this analogy in which he said, like in chemistry, where elements are the smallest bits of matter that we can look at, elements in behavior are the smallest bits of behavior that we can practice and measure on their own. And if they're at the right frequencies, they can easily combine into compounds, just as chemical elements combine into compounds based on valence. And out of that work, and part of that work was related to what some of you will recognize as the big six, that is fine motor skills, and big six plus six, in addition to reach, point, touch, grasp, place, release, although twist, pull, push, and so forth. And then body control movements, gross body movements. And then, as I mentioned earlier, out of Hastings County, Eric also worked with and taught Michael Maloney about precision teaching. And so out of that work together came precision teaching plus direct instruction, which formed the foundation for the Morningside model and what people have done elsewhere. The curriculum balance sheet was a tool that I'll show you, but it was a way of understanding and analyzing the relationship between curriculum components and composites. I recall when on a phone call actually with Eric, where we got very clear that we should use the word fluency, and I'll come back to that later. And then toward the end of his life, Eric was always interested in creativity and thinking, and he got very involved with Edward de Bono's work and beginning to apply precision teaching to it. And then the final thing, which I will show you, and I don't think many people on the planet have seen this, a developmental model, which I think has the potential for blowing away 2,000 years of latencies and milestones, ways of thinking about human development. So that's an overview, but let's dig into some of it. These are two of the publications that came out of his work with Arthur Loeb when he was at Harvard. And what you can see, you probably can't see it easily, but on the left one there, the symmetry, the case history of program, he says, at first, a series of frames in a linear sequence and in a nonverbal format was tested. So this is a really big deal. People were doing programmed instruction. There were sort of origins, really, of systematic instructional design. And they were doing it, of course, usually with words. It was teaching concepts and so forth. But Eric and Arthur Loeb created sequences of visual shapes that people could actually learn from that had no words associated with them. So these are a couple of publications that I think you can find someplace on the internet if you look. Here's what was early called precise behavior management. Those of you who know about the standard behavior chart, the standard acceleration chart, can see that this has the same cycles of 10 up the left, multiplicative cycles, and school days or calendar time across the bottom. But you'll notice that there's no record floor. They were measuring for all day. So on the left, you see, and these were from basically a working paper that Eric published in 1967 when he was at Kansas. But multiplication facts correct per minute. Notice they're between 1 and 10 a minute, and the improvement was up to like maybe 20 a minute. Well, this is when you measured them in the long periods, and this before they were using 1 minute timings. And then on the right, you see they're measuring puts and pushes, problem behavior. They want to decelerate. Now, this was then called precise behavior management before the short timings and precision teaching applications. And interestingly, if you notice in there, there's statistical tests. And this is when they were sort of working in the education department and hadn't yet realized that with this work, we could produce changes that were so large that you didn't have to do statistical tests to prove that they were real. This particular publication, which was a chapter in a book devoted to precision teaching, and the book was called Let's Try Doing Something Else kind of thing, and it was published by the Council for Exceptional Children in 1972. This particular article, Aims, Growing, and Sharing, had more of an influence on me professionally than anything other than Skinner's articles and books, because in it, he talks about the work that he, and in particular his graduate students, Clay and Ann Starlin, had done to begin to understand that if you are looking at something like reading or mathematics or other curriculum areas, that students learn and perform better if the components of those things can be built to fluency rather than working on big chunks where none of the components are fluent. And so it also established the notion that we can set aims or goals for count per minute performance of those components, and we can actually make instructional decisions about that. This is a profoundly impactful article, and most people I know in precision teaching in particular have or certainly should have encountered this. And like many of the publications that I'm telling you about, you can find them on downloadable at fluency.org. This was from that chapter in that book, and it's an example of the correlation chart. So on the right, you can see the correlation chart, and you can actually download that from a link on the front page of fluency.org. And you can see what it has. It has both up the left and across the bottom count per minute cycles of 10, much like the standard behavior chart has up the left. And if you look at the example on the left, you'll see this reflects, and I think this may be data from, it's possible this is data from Clay Starlin's thesis, because when Clay was a doctoral student, he was working with both Barbara Bateman, who is an exceptional leader in the study of reading, and with Eric, who of course was applying rate of response in classrooms and doing precision teaching type of stuff. And Clay actually discovered the relationship between say sounds and say words, that if you are trying to teach kids to read words, they need to get good at saying the sounds of the individual letters. And if you can accelerate that performance of that component, the composite will accelerate more quickly. And so notice the tight correlation in the orange oval there, because this is a bunch of individuals with the individuals, each dot is the frequency of an individual say sounds and say words. And so this is a tight correlation, as you can see. So Clay needs to be credited with sort of the first discoveries in this component frequency thing. And Eric ran with it for pretty much the rest of his career. This is an article, it's actually an internal thing that he did while he was at York University, and it's on fluency.org also. But he talked about performance locking. And the notion was that once you looked at behavior frequencies on a standard chart, you could hit frequencies and not sort of get past them for various reasons. And so this is a piece that, again, you can download from fluency.org, but it lists a whole lot of factors that hold performance in place, that lock performance. And later, my own work in B. Barrett's lab classroom, when she turned it over to me, and I was working in it for 9 years, managing research there and also training teachers all over New England and elsewhere, we developed a whole way of thinking about this that we discovered we called ceilings on performance. And that was until 1979, but it was very much influenced by my early work, advice by Eric Haughton. And this one I just like to share because one of the things that happened early on, and I think it really started at Kansas with Og Lindsley and his students, with people like Abigail Calkin and others, is that people were counting their own behavior, their thoughts, their feelings, their own behavior, steps or et cetera. And they were using various kinds of mechanical counters, some of which worked pretty well. But someone designed, as it says, one day Bob and Judy from Ambler, Arkansas, visited Elizabeth and me. They took up the idea of counting, but didn't appreciate mechanical counters or their cost. So they picked up a piece of leather thong from around the Oregon ranch and strung a few wooden beads on it. The birth of our prototype bead abacus counter. So Eric actually published a little article in Teaching Exceptional Children about how to make one of these these wrist counters. It's basically a nice piece of leather that you put around your wrist, which with beads on them. And as you can see, again, typical Eric in the article, he talks about having a piece of good stiff oak tan leather and then equally large piece of really soft, sexy leather for a liner. I don't think I've ever seen a phrase like that in an academic journal before, but that was Eric. And in fact, Clay Starlin still brings these kinds of wrist counters to conferences and shares them with people. When Eric was at York University in Canada as a professor, he also became editor of Special Education in Canada. And this is in the early 70s, about when I met him also. I met him in 73, 74 timeframe. But these are just a few of the articles that he published as editor, risk counter, curriculum options, about math components, et cetera, about setting aims, about the things that were being learned during that period. And so Eric was an important contributor in getting the word out in printed form. And this is from one of the issues where he defined two terms that were later used in other contexts. Actually, they were used earlier than this. But he says tool skills are the simplest element of a skill, while combinations of two or three elements classify as basic skills. So this language came out of work with things like reading and mathematics, where writing digits and reading digits, for example, are tool skills for writing answers to math facts and so forth. But it was beginning to establish some of the nomenclature here. This is learning channels that many of you may know about, but not everybody does. And so it's worth mentioning. This was not uniquely Eric Haughton's contribution, although he ran with it, as you'll see in the Learning Channel Matrix. But this was developed to sort of clarify things that would happen. For example, if a teacher is working on a child's, let's say, writing answers to math facts or writing digits, and a mom has been working with their child, let's say, saying numbers. And one of them comes to the other and says, well, my child knows his numbers. And the teacher will say, well, what do you mean? We're just trying to work on that. And it turns out they're talking about different learning channels because this language, input and output, was a way of describing the form of input. So, for example, am I seeing a number on a piece of paper? Am I hearing it? Am I just thinking it, etc.? And then what's the output? Is the right output saying the answer or writing the answer and so forth? And so when you define the input and output, so-called, you've got a very precise definition of the behavior that you're trying to teach or measure. And you also have a clarification for anybody who's talking about it. Now, Ogden Lindsley didn't really like this language very well because it sounded like he was a radical behavior scientist, and he thought it sounded like there was somehow some kind of like process, computer in the brain. And so he insisted on replacing the word think, as in think do, to free. So instead of saying, well, I'm going to think write words in an essay, he'd say, no, free write is what it is. It's without any prompt you're performing. So there was a little bit of a sort of a squabble around that language. A lot of people still use think say or think write, but that's about learning channels early on. And this was really before 1980 that this work was going on, quite a bit before 1980, but it didn't really get out in any literature form much until Eric wrote about it. And I'm going to come back to the Learning Channel Matrix shortly. But in 1976 originally, and then this is an example from 1980, Eric developed what he called the curriculum balance sheet. And the idea was, and you can see up in the middle there, in the middle, you've got some area of curriculum. And so this is actually from Eric and a copy that I have in my files. And you see counting, objects, forward, backwards, recognition, and so forth in the math curriculum. And right at the top there, you see a little hand-drawn learning channel matrix. It's an early example of that. And in the prepare side, you see these elements, these big six: reach, point, touch, grasp, press, release, see, match objects, hear, say, repeat. So learning channels are being used, and these are components on the far left of the tool. And then on the right, you're looking at the compounds or the composites that are combinations of these two things. And so this was a way for Eric to get his students and proteges to begin thinking about curriculum in terms of components and composites. And there's a thing that Elizabeth Haughton and I used to joke about a lot, which is called the purpose indicator. There's one both the right and the left. And it's this little kind of parallelogram where Eric said, well, we know what the range of performance of a competent person is. Let's say on writing answers to math facts, it might be something like 60 to 110 a minute. So we know there's a range of competence. And so he would always want to ask students, do you want to be just like barely within the minimum of what we know is probably pretty good? Or do you want to be in the middle someplace, or do you want to be at the top? And so he would have students engage by saying, where do you want to be? What's your purpose here? And Elizabeth and I used to joke about it a lot just because the name purpose indicator, but also because Elizabeth Haughton herself continued in her own work, in her Haughton Learning Center work, to have a whole lot of ways where children would engage by saying how good they wanted to be at a thing. And this is really the beginnings of that. Now, this, I believe, is in the end Eric Haughton's most important contribution. And I first encountered it in 1978 when I was fortunate. I'd been working in B. Barrett's lab, and I'd known Eric and sort of been getting advised by him for about 5 years. And he became my real thesis advisor. He was the one that really drove my thesis on what's called endurance. But this was at a conference that I was sort of honored to be really on a panel with B. Barrett, who was then my boss, and me and Eric Haughton. By the way, I noticed that Barrett's name is missing a T there. I misspelled it. But in any case, the name of the session was Parameters of People Freedom. And it was at the American Association for the Education of the Severely and Profoundly Handicapped, which was later turned to TASH. And I don't even know if that organization still exists. But we had this symposium. What you see before you, first of all, at the top, everything is a frequency is something that Eric occasionally said, and he meant behavior, but he also meant, the frequency of light. But this was a hand-drawn version of the chart, of the standard behavior chart that he created. You can see it's standard chart, 0.001 a minute all the way up to 1,000 a minute on the left. Across the bottom is a monthly chart, so it's monthly, so it's frequencies. Now, if you look at this, he was then working on these components. Now, Edwards and Edwards had published, I think in 71 or 72, an article about counting fetal kicks. And we knew there was a frequency that you could begin to pick up if you were mom and you were quiet and you counted them from the few weeks, I think maybe 6 weeks into gestation period. When a woman was pregnant, she could begin to feel movement of the fetus. And that those frequencies grow in a very reliable form. And I've assigned that to pregnant students before, and it's quite replicable. So we knew that these body movements were happening before birth. And then at birth, what we also knew was that there were sounds that were coming out. There were various head, trunk, hip, leg control movements, what Eric called body control movements. There were fine motor skills. There were components of transporting or moving around. And then that children were able to spend increasingly more time on any given activity, what we later called endurance. So we called it that, actually, because Eric and I sort of glommed onto that term. And then the joke he always made was when school started, all of a sudden endurance went to not very much because you were asking kids to do things they weren't good at, and that the frequencies also went lower. But at that point, you were starting to do academic skills of various kinds and verbal skills and so forth. So this was a thing he called the biochart 001. And I don't know that there was ever a 002. I happen to have a transparency in my files that I made a copy of here. I'm not sure how many other people on the planet have ever seen this. But in my view, this is a profound contribution. Because if you look back in the history, what you recognize is that the history of human understanding of development since Aristotle and Plato has been framed, including by developmental psychologists, as milestones and latency periods. So, for example, the child first crawls. He's able to move across the floor crawling. That's a milestone. Oh my God, that's incredible. And then there's supposedly a latency period that maybe nothing seems to be happening until the child can, let's say, lift himself up or herself on and do cruising, walk around the room holding his or herself on a piece of furniture. And then there's maybe a period of time during which apparently nothing is happening if you're just looking at whether gross certain changes are occurring. And then you say, oh my God, the kid can walk. And so all of development from birth on is framed not only by Aristotle and Plato and medieval people, but also by current day developmental psychologists as sort of an absence, presence, or accuracy thing, where there are these periods where allegedly nothing is happening. But when we take Skinner's measure, when we take rate of response, and when we have the understanding that Eric Haughton and Clay Starlin and others brought to us and that we've refined over the years, you recognize that under the surface, there are all these frequencies of behavior, fine and gross motor skills, oral motor skills, all kinds of things that are bubbling. They're increasing, they're combining, they're doing all kinds of stuff. And then all of a sudden something happens that we adults or whatever recognize, oh my God, the kid is crawling now. But in the meantime, all kinds of leg extensions and hip movements and head lifts and all kinds of stuff were increasing by frequency. It's just we didn't name them until some big thing happened. If you were a behavior scientist and you had frequency and the measure of frequency, and you began to measure from gestation to adulthood, and you began to look at the critical components evolving, you would have an entirely different, entirely more useful and detailed picture of what it means to develop as a human. It would look more like the history of evolution of the species than it would look like some sort of step function. And so I would like to propose that anybody who sees this share it with their colleagues, because there is an entire program of research here that could go on for decades, changing our view of development from latency periods and milestones to bubbling, bursting, combining active frequencies of all kinds of components and composites that we can watch evolve over time. So let that sink in, I guess, is the answer, because you got to reflect on this for a minute until it gets really clear, I think. During that period, and actually a little bit after that 1978 bit, he was actively working on body control movements. He was working with what's called a physiotherapist. We call them physical therapists in the US, but Mary Kovacs was a physiotherapist. And they had a team of people, and they were working on head, trunk, hip, and leg control movements. And this is just one page from the document. Again, it's on fluency.org. This happens to be head control developmental pinpoints. And notice what they've done is they've captured adult competent performance under different conditions. So a guided head up, a touch. So you're just prompting the performer to lift his or her head. You're then saying one with just an audio input, hear head up, and then free or think head up. And there are different frequency ranges for each of those. So they were beginning to actually document what that biochart picture was suggesting, which is that we can define competent frequencies of, in this case, body control movements. And this thing goes on for pages of different body parts with frequencies. So the starting place is, it's like looking how many lobes there are in an oak leaf out in nature. It's let's look at a bunch of humans that are competent. Let's see what their behavior frequencies are. And that's at least a starting place for figuring out what the aims or goals ought to be. And then they did the same thing with the so-called Big Six: reach, point, touch, grasp, place, release. And so that's on the left, a page of that work. In this case, it was reach, different kinds of reaches with different degrees of support. The thing on the right is actually reflects the influence of Eric's work on my work and my students, because Jim Pollard, who was a master's student of mine and was managing a whole special needs program, he did an assessment in the summer of 1980 on a whole bunch of different forms of grasping and releasing. And so this work that Eric had sort of begun was beginning to go out into work, be applied in a lot of ways. At one point, Jim Pollard in the Merrimack Education Collaborative, believe it was, he had occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language therapists, and teachers all using the standard acceleration chart and behavior frequency, a shared sensitive measurement framework. And included in that were various kinds of assessments that they did. In this case, it was just of grasp release, because that was such an important component of the behavior needed to teach vocational and self-care skills for kids who had handicaps. Here's the learning channel matrix. And this is one version. This is in 1980 was really the first time that this got published. But what you can see up the left is it's got the outputs. They do have think instead of free. He held on to that pretty strongly. And then at the bottom, you could put whatever the output forms, what the forms of behavior were. And this is one version of it, as he called the planning matrix. He developed a whole bunch of other versions, and so did I, frankly. But what's interesting about the evolution of that is this is an example from when he was working at Loyalist College. And what he would do with students, in this case, it was a student, um, uh, but he also did it with us who he was training, would use this tool as a brainstorming tool. He would lay out the matrix of the inputs and outputs that might be involved in some curriculum area or some developmental area. And he would have us generate as many ideas as we could. And he actually counted per minute so that we could get really good at generating ideas for components to work on. Because the notion would be that this ability to analyze quickly what possible components are and brainstorm them would then allow a clinician or an educator to more easily come up with things in a diagnostic prescriptive way with their students. There were pages and pages of this that I have, but this happens to be one example. And then this actually was fast forward in my own work because this is not really 1980. This was more like in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was training corporate sales and customer service trainers to use fluency-based instruction, to use learning channels to break behavior down to components. So this, I think, was a practice sheet. Oh, is an answer key to a practice sheet that came from my work. I just pulled it out because it shows you it's got the learning channels down the left, and then it's got the specific description of the performance statements in there. And this just shows you the impact. I believe that learning channels in the matrix are one of the most powerful tools in instructional design. And if you define the accomplishment you hope the learner will produce, a widget, a meal, an assembled thing, whatever it is, and then you break it down using learning channels, you'll be able to define the components that need to be built to fluency. And then this shows you an even further extension because I have some colleagues in Italy, in particular led by a woman named Dr. Francesca Cavallini, who, when she was a doctoral student, reached out to me and came to the US and learned from Elizabeth Haughton and me and the Fit Learning folks precision teaching. And when she went back there at some point, she created an Italian version of the learning channel matrix. This document, which I'd forgotten about until I prepared for this presentation, was written in 1980, and it's actually was in the Journal of Precision Teaching, which was a journal that we published for some years from the precision teaching community. And it's called Practicing Practices Learning by Activity. It's on our fluency.org website. It is, and that QR code will get you there, but you can also just go to fluency.org and look under the Haughton page. This has an enormous amount of really powerful stuff in it. So it is probably as important as the Ames Growing and Sharing a publication in some ways. I think it has the first published example of the learning channel matrix, a kind of a crude version of it. Here's an example that I mentioned. This is in a curriculum area for regular students. It's basically a tool for analyzing and possibly planning for a student, looking across learning channels. This is also a really important example of something. And notice down at the bottom, it's called a snapshot. Something that we began doing really in the late 70s. And you can see this was 1976 was the first version of this. And Eric, I think, taught us to do this, although B. Barrett, the woman I worked with for 10 years, also did a lot of this in a more formal way, which would be if we were looking at a whole bunch of skills, and if you look across the bottom, you will see these are sort of component skills. And Elizabeth and Eric Haughton collected this data from some other folks up in Thunder Bay in Ontario. But the idea is you get a bunch of adults and maybe some little kids, different groups, and you do 30-second or 1-minute timings on components, and you look at the range, because what we've learned from this work on the standard chart, especially because it allows us to look at ranges as multipliers, is that for almost any competent skill in a group of people that are all pretty good at it, sort of up to par, there's a range typically of times, at least 1.5 to times 2. That is, the fastest person is likely to be 1.5 times to 2 times as quick as the slowest. And that's the normal range. And then, if you live in Mississippi, you speak more slowly than if you live in Boston, et cetera. And that within any group, there's a range of competence. And so you can get really quick snapshots. You can be in a room with people, and I've done this in training programs quite often, and take 20 minutes out and do a bunch of short timings with a group and show people exactly what the ranges are and the skills that you're looking at. And so this was an important example in this 1980 publication of stuff that we'd really been doing sometime before that, but this was kind of the first time that I know of that it got published in any depth. The other thing that Eric was a major contributor to was our use of the word fluency, because prior to that, prior to about 1977, 1978, the words proficiency and mastery were being used by precision teachers to talk about what it means to be good at something. And we were beginning to define the ranges of performance, as you could see on those snapshots in the previous slide, what it meant to be good at something. And we tended to think of rate of response, being correct and being quick. So accuracy plus speed was a common framework that we used, but we were still talking about proficiency or mastery. And I remember a phone conversation in which Eric and I were speaking about this in the mid to late 70s, in which we said, the problem with those two words is that they don't have the time dimension, which is the word fluency implies the time dimension. We know about it from speaking fluency, and we also know about it from the reading literature, even though reading literature is a little fuzzy about how you measure it sometimes. So what we began to recognize was we should use the word fluency when we're talking to teachers, to parents, to learners of any kind, as our definition of mastery. And we traditionally talked about accuracy plus speed, but what Eric really added to this in a big way, and I remember the mini workshop that he did in the late 70s where he introduced this to us, was this notion that sometimes it's quality plus pace. That is, it doesn't always go as fast as you can. You might want to practice reading until you can read very quickly, but then if you want to read, if you want prosody, if you want to read with expression, you slow down. If you're doing a dance or you're playing a piece of music or many, many other things, you want to look at it's being mostly a qualitative response and the pace at which you can do it. If we look at how somebody does handwriting, we're not looking at correct and incorrect letters only. We might be just looking at properly formed ones. So we're looking at qualitative characteristics of the response as well as the pace of it. And also, as he added, rhythm. Eric was talking about rhythm from the first time I ever met him in the early 70s. The notion that when we're really competent at many things, it's not only a certain pace of performance, but there's often a certain rhythm in it. Again, dance, music, and so forth. Then also, and we sort of extended this when we did management training and when we worked with, when I worked with executives and professional trainers and customer service and call centers, is the notion of doing the right thing without hesitation. So if you're a vice principal on the playground and the kids start to have a fight, you ought to be able to very quickly intervene and prevent them from hurting themselves there, then, without much hesitation. If you're a jet fighter and you are in a dogfight and something happens weirdly, you need to be able to move quickly once. It's not repeated, but you need to be able to do the right thing without hesitation. There are many, many parts of our lives, our performance, where doing the right thing without hesitation is a good description of mastery or fluency. We may need to practice it repeatedly, even in a timed format, to do that. But when we actually observe mastery, we may be able to see people doing things once without hesitating. And then often, and this sort of plugs back into the literature of cognitive psychology and common parlance, but the notion of automaticity or second nature response is also really what we're often talking about when we mean fluency. So there's a whole language communication thing, which in many ways follows on what Ogden Lindsley thought in 1965 when he said we need to use plain English rather than technical jargon. Another thing that Eric started was using acronyms to describe the outcomes or the results of achieving fluent performance. And he started out with retention application performance standards, RAPS. And I remember talking about that in the mid 70s. And that was really based on just clinical educational practice. What we noticed was, with respect to retention, that, for example, if an elementary school student could write answers to simple addition facts at, let's say, 50 or 60 a minute by May, if they came back in September after not having practiced that, they probably still could maintain most of that performance. And if we increased the frequency, the retention would be even better. On the other hand, if that child could only do maybe 20 a minute, in May, that performance might be gone by September. And so teachers started to notice that frequency was a very good predictor of retention. And the whole component composite relationship was about application, and application meaning the combination of components. So if I can write digits and if I can read digits, I can apply those by combining them and writing answers to math facts. So that was well understood. And then the word endurance appeared in the mid 70s. And I remember Eric using that term with me. And this led eventually to my doctoral dissertation being about that, because what happened was, in this very specific case, I was consulting with a bunch of special ed teachers, and I was in a particular classroom with a woman named Denise Van Eyck as a teacher. And she was working with a little kid putting pieces into a puzzle. And uh, uh, what we observed was on the chart, this kid was working for about a minute at a time, for 1 minute, and she was counting the number of pieces put in the puzzle correctly and the number of errors. And the errors were either put in the wrong place, the piece of the puzzle, or maybe thrown across the room. And so I was observing this, and I looked at the chart, and I just said to Denise, I said, "What if you just did timings for 15 seconds?" And she did that. And in 15 seconds, the kid didn't throw any. And over a period of days, you saw gradual increase and you saw the variability reduce. And we said, wait a minute, there's something going on here. And so I then did a dissertation showing the relationship between fluency and the ability to perform for extended periods of time, and despite any distracting environmental stuff. And we called that endurance. And so Eric was my thesis advisor, but he added E to RAPS or REAPS so that became retention endurance application standards. Now, this is a little bit of a joke, but it's true enough. What happened after that was, for a period of time, there was this small industry of acronyms. People were adding new findings. They decided endurance didn't really cover it, so they needed to talk about stability. They readjusted them. So one of our colleagues used areas. They changed the letters. They did all kinds of things. I personally thought, sort of missed the point then, that we knew achieving fluency achieved these high levels of long-term outcomes. And if you can retain the thing, and if it endures, you pretty much got what you need, and apply them. But in any event, that led to a lot of more fine-grained looking at the impacts of achieving fluent performance and defining fluent performance. And people like Michael Fabrizio, for example, who working with kids on the spectrum, and his colleagues, they began to look carefully when they would achieve a child would achieve some level frequency of performance. Maybe it wasn't quite up to what we thought the aims were, but they would do checks to see if there was retention weeks later, or endurance or application. And they would use those to sort of validate that the kid had achieved the level he needed to. And if he didn't, they'd go back and increase the frequency. I already mentioned the chemical analogy, the notion that behavior elements are the smallest movement cycles or bits of behavior that can be practiced and measured on their own, and they're part of compounds. And that's how Eric began to think about it, because when he was going after Big 6+6 as well as body control movements, he said, we want to figure out the smallest bits that we can practice and measure. And that got recorded in a newsletter that I published for some years called the Data Sharing Newsletter. And that was written about in 81. And I think it's the first time that analogy was ever written about anywhere. Another important thing that emerged from all of this, and it was really implicit in what had been going on much earlier, that Eric wrote a paper for the journal Precision Teaching called Standards Refining Measurement. And in it, he talked about the distinction between testing, which is sort of one-time fixed tests, and monitoring, which is what we do in precision teaching, which is where we're measuring performance in an ongoing way, and we're making decisions in a dynamic way about do we need to change or not? If so, how do we change? So monitoring becomes a much more powerful and sensitive way to help children or anyone else learn. And that distinction was very clear in that article. And then, very much toward the end of his life, for the years especially that I was close to Eric and tend to spend time with him and Elizabeth in their home and so forth, he got very excited about this fellow, Edward de Bono, who wrote a bunch of books about lateral thinking, about creativity, about thinking. And so Eric got extremely excited about this. And this is a note that he sent me in 1982. And it's a little hard to read his script. So here's the typed version of it. He said, "Dear Carl, at long last, teaching thinking and autographed by the author." He had actually gotten a couple of de Bono's books that de Bono had signed for him. And he said, "You'll enjoy. Now what we need to do is combine de Bono, Logo, and precision teaching." Wow, what chemistry. Logo was then a computer language that was built for children so they could begin to understand in very simple ways how to program and be logical. And then he says, "Elizabeth has taken a course on Logo, is doing some good work, also taking the Apple II to her classroom." And this was the beginnings. This was before graphic user interface phase, when the Apple II was the first personal computer before IBM cloned it in the IBM PC. And he said, "I thought spring would be winding down, but it's winding up instead. Aloha," their sailboat is in the water, which, by the way, Michael Maloney now owns. "We've slept aboard a couple of times. Very nice, lovely." The cat sends her love, Eric. He was very personable also, of course, but this was a really big deal, and he was very excited about it. And I think if he'd lived longer, he would have probably pursued this in much more detail. And so this is the end of the presentation. You can go to fluency.org, which is put up there by the Fluency Project, and there is a page devoted to Eric's work, much of it unpublished, and there will be more in the future. So I thank you if you've made it to the end of this. I'm really hoping that it's useful as a kind of a chronology and as a way to explain. I actually think that Eric Haughton, by the time he died at 51 years old in 1985, had pretty much discovered and invented all of the essentials of what we now, many decades later, call precision teaching, and was called precision teaching then. I think he was a creative genius behind all of this, laid a foundation, and we are definitely standing on his shoulders. So thank you very much.